The Battle of Tarawa lasted 76 hours and was an American victory. The official communique, issued November 23, 1943, described fierce fighting and the capture of strategic objectives, both accurate. What the communique did not describe was what several hundred meters of open reef looked like when the boats stopped and the Marines had to walk, or what the photographs of that looked like when someone in Washington finally decided Americans were allowed to see them. Both of those omissions were deliberate. Only one of them was corrected. Betio Island sits at the southwestern tip of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, an islet barely 3 kilometers long and at its widest point a few hundred meters across. On a map of the Pacific, it is close to nothing. In November of 1943, it was, for a handful of days, the most contested piece of ground in the theater. The planners assigned to the assault had a problem that showed up on their charts as a single geographic feature, a coral reef ringing the approach to the northern beaches, the side selected for the landing. The question the planners had to answer was whether the tide on the chosen date would run high enough to carry landing craft over that reef and up to the beach itself. Their calculations said it would. The reef, in the planning documents, was a line, a hazard noted, assessed, and, in the judgment of the officers responsible for the operation, accounted for. This is worth stating plainly because it matters for what follows. The reef was not an oversight. It was a known variable that the tide was supposed to neutralize. Before any Marine went into the water, the Navy delivered a pre-landing bombardment against the Japanese positions on Betio. Something in the range of 3,000 tons of naval ordnance across roughly 2.5 hours. A weight of fire that exceeded almost anything American planners had thrown at a single objective this size to that point in the Pacific War. The bombardment was not designed to kill every Japanese soldier on the island. It was designed to suppress the defenses long enough for the boats to cross the reef and the Marines to land against resistance that had been reduced to something manageable. The boats did not cross. What the bombardment was working against deserves its own accounting, because the failure of 3,000 tons of naval gunfire to open a clean path onto Betio is not, on its face, an intuitive outcome. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki's garrison had spent roughly a year fortifying an island a fraction of the size of a typical American town. Reinforced concrete bunkers with walls thick enough to absorb direct hits from naval rifles. Interlocking fields of fire from coconut log and coral and sand positions reinforced with steel, and gun emplacements sited specifically to sweep the approach lanes rather than the beach itself. Some of the largest coastal defense guns on the island had been salvaged from Singapore, captured from British forces nearly 2 years earlier and repositioned to face the water Marines would eventually have to cross. This was, by the standards of Pacific Island fortification in 1943, one of the most heavily engineered defensive positions the Marine Corps would face in the entire war. The bombardment was accurate. It was also, against fortifications built to this standard, insufficient to do what the plan required of it. Colonel David Shoup commanded the assault force that would land on Betio's northern beaches on the morning of November 20th. He had studied the same charts the planners had used, understood the same tidal calculation, and carried the same professional confidence that the reef, noted, assessed, accounted for, would not be the thing that decided the day. He was a professional, reading a plan that had not yet been tested against the specific water conditions of a specific morning in the Gilbert Islands. The plan assumed the tide would cooperate. If you've never heard the name Tarawa, and most people who know every other battle in the Pacific haven't, share this with someone who should know it. The reason it stays forgotten is the same reason the photographs were held back. Not malice, just the assumption that some things are easier not to look at. The landing craft began their run toward the beach in the early morning hours of November 20th, 1943, carrying Shoup's Marines toward a reef that the tide, on that specific morning, did not fully cover. The first landing craft reached the reef and stopped. This was not supposed to happen. The tidal calculation that had governed the planning of this assault assumed enough water over the coral to carry the Higgins boats across it. On the morning of November 20th, that water was not there in sufficient depth, and the boats, flat-bottomed, built for exactly this kind of shallow water work, but not built to cross exposed coral, grounded somewhere in the range of 500 to 700 meters from the beach. The Marines aboard had two choices, and only one of them was actually a choice. They went over the sides and into the water. Depth across the reef varied, waist-deep in places, closer to chest-deep in the low channels that cut through the coral, the water rising and falling with the terrain beneath it in ways no man crossing it could have mapped in advance. What this meant in practice was several hundred meters of exposed wading, weapons held overhead, equipment soaked, every man in that water visible from shore for the entire duration of the crossing. The Japanese defense had not been built around the assumption that landing craft would carry Marines directly onto the sand. It had been built around lateral fire, positions sighted to sweep along the beach and the water approaching it, rather than facing the water head-on. This detail matters because it means the boat stopping short of the beach was not, from the perspective of Shibazaki's defensive design, a stroke of Japanese luck. The reef was already part of what the fortifications had been positioned to exploit. Whether or not any single Japanese officer had specifically planned for American landing craft to run aground there. A slow-moving column of men in open water, at a fixed and predictable range, was precisely the target these positions had been built to service. The Marines who reached the beach did not reach it because the Japanese defense failed. They reached it because they walked through it anyway. Shoup, coordinating from a command position with radio reports arriving in fragments, did not have anything like a complete picture of what was happening across that reef in the first hour of the landing. What he had were the reports themselves: men down, boats stalled, waves of the assault stacking up behind each other in water that offered no cover and no speed. Survivor accounts from the crossing describe machine gun fire cutting the surface of the water around them as they waded. The specific helplessness of men who could not run, could not dive for cover, and could not return fire effectively while moving through chest-deep water with a rifle held over their heads. Some men went down and did not come back up. Others kept moving because moving forward was, in that specific stretch of water, marginally less lethal than stopping. The first waves that reached the beach did so bloodied and reduced in number. And what greeted them on the sand was not open ground. It was a seawall, a low coconut log barrier that offered the only cover available on the entire beach, and behind which the surviving Marines of the first assault pressed themselves while the fighting continued around them. The fighting on Betio ran for 76 hours, and no summary of that span can substitute for what it actually consisted of. Position by position, bunker by bunker. A few meters of coral sand gained and held at a cost that outpaced almost anything the Marine Corps had experienced in the Pacific to that point. Colonel Shoup spent much of the first day pinned behind that seawall with the survivors of the initial assault, coordinating what reinforcement and resupply could be pushed across the same reef that had already cost so many of his men simply reaching the beach. His communications went out in fragments, the way communications from an active battle always do. Incomplete pictures, urgent requests, reports assembled from whatever information had reached him in the preceding minutes. At some point during that first day, he sent a message back through the chain of command that would become the single document most closely associated with his name. Casualties many. Percentage of dead not known. Combat efficiency? We are winning. Read outside its context, that message could be mistaken for confidence bordering on detachment. Read inside its context, a colonel behind a low seawall, incomplete casualty reports arriving from a beach where men were still dying in numbers he could not yet total. It becomes something closer to the most honest report a commander can produce under fire. It was accurate on both counts. The casualties were many. The percentage of dead was not yet known. And the Marines were, in the strict military sense of ground being taken and held, winning. All three statements were true simultaneously, and Shoup did not soften any of them to make the others easier to hear. This is the paradox at the center of the entire battle, compressed into one radio message. An accurate report of a battle being won can also be an accurate report of catastrophic loss. Those are not contradictory facts. They are the same fact, described from the only vantage point available to the man reporting it. The days that followed the first brought the same grinding calculus repeated across dozens of individual Japanese positions. A bunker cleared here, a pillbox reduced there, ground measured in meters rather than the sweeping advances that later Pacific campaigns would sometimes achieve. Each position taken had its own specific cost, paid by specific men whose names exist in the after-action record, even where this account does not have room to list them individually. By the time organized Japanese resistance effectively ended, something close to 1,000 Americans were dead, and more than 2,000 wounded. Out of a landing force that had come ashore across a reef nobody had planned for them to cross on foot. The official communique that would eventually reach the American public described this as fierce fighting and the capture of strategic objectives. Shoup's message, sent from behind a seawall while the outcome was still very much in doubt, was the raw material that communique would eventually be built from. Both documents would turn out to be accurate. Only one of them would be published in the form the public actually saw. If this is the history you want more of, subscribe. One story like this every week. The Japanese defense of Betio was not improvised. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki's garrison had spent roughly a year turning an islet smaller than most American neighborhoods into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of ground in the Pacific theater. Every element of that fortification, the bunkers, the interlocking fire lanes, the positioning of coastal guns to sweep the water rather than face it directly, reflected a defensive logic that had been thought through with real professional care. The design was not built around the hope that Americans would fail to land. It was built around a specific and colder calculation that if the Americans did land, the cost of taking this island would be so severe that it would shape how every subsequent Pacific landing was planned. Shibazaki is widely quoted as having said that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to take Tarawa, an attribution that requires care in how it's handled, but that captures, whether or not the exact words are his, the confidence the defensive design was meant to justify. The design worked in the narrow sense that it was supposed to work. It killed close to 1,000 Americans and wounded more than 2,000 more in 76 hours. It did not achieve the actual objective, which was to hold the island. Approximately 4,690 Japanese defenders occupied Betio when the assault began. 17 combatant survivors remained when the fighting stopped. Think about that for a second. A defense that inflicted casualties at a rate almost unmatched anywhere else in the Pacific War to that point in the conflict still ended in near total annihilation of the force that built it. The design was correct in almost every particular, and the outcome was still total loss. And both of those facts sit next to each other without resolving into anything simpler. Shibazaki did not design a defense that would defeat the Americans. He designed a defense that would cost them everything it possibly could, and then fail anyway. Those were not the same objective. He achieved one, he did not achieve the other. His own death is recorded, though the precise circumstances vary across sources. Some accounts place it during the pre-landing naval bombardment on the morning of November 20th, which would mean the defense that inflicted these casualties was, for most of the battle, commanded by a dead man and the officers who inherited his position. Whichever account is accurate, the defense he had designed continued functioning on its own logic well after any single commander could have been directing it in real time. Among the survivors on Betio when the fighting ended were roughly 129 Korean laborers. Men brought to the island not as combatants, but as forced construction labor. The workforce that had built the very bunkers and gun emplacements the Marines spent 76 hours clearing. They were armed, when armed at all, with construction tools rather than weapons designed for combat, and they were not absorbed into the fighting the way the Japanese garrison was. Their survival rate, set against the near total loss of the combat garrison around them, is its own kind of fact worth sitting with. They had not chosen to be on this island. They had built the machine that killed 1,000 Americans, without being given the standing of the men who operated it. And when the machine finally failed, they were among the very few left standing to see it fail. The island was declared secured on November 23, 1943, 76 hours after the first landing craft grounded on the reef. What the Marine Corps carried away from Betio went beyond the casualty count. The fortification design that had cost so many American lives, the lateral fire lanes, the reinforced bunkers, the way the reef itself had been incorporated into the killing ground, even though no Japanese engineer had built the coral, became in the months that followed a study document. American amphibious doctrine for every subsequent Pacific landing would carry lessons drawn directly from what had defeated the first wave on this beach. The enemy's design, which had inflicted the cost, became the sourcebook for how the Americans would attack every island that came after it. The photographs were already on their way to Washington. The reef at Betio, photographed at low tide after the fighting ended, looks at first like nothing in particular: flat coral, shallow water, the ordinary texture of a Pacific shoreline. It is only in the context of what happened across that same stretch of water 3 days earlier that the photograph becomes something else. The ground zero of a decision that had already been building in Washington before a single Marine set foot on it. Through 1943, American policy on publishing photographs of American war dead had been under active review at the highest levels of the war information apparatus. The default posture through the early years of the war had leaned toward suppression. The belief that images of dead American servicemen would damage public morale and weaken support for the war effort at a moment when that support could not be assumed to be unlimited. By the fall of 1943, that posture was shifting, and the reasoning behind the shift was not cynical. It reflected a genuine institutional judgment that a public asked to sustain an increasingly costly war needed to understand, in concrete terms, what that cost actually looked like. Not to demoralize them, but to deepen a commitment that abstraction could not sustain on its own. Photographs from Tarawa arrived in this environment. Combat photography from the battle reached American publication in the weeks that followed the fighting, part of the broader movement toward more candid imagery that the policy review of 1943 had already set in motion. The communiqué said Tarawa was secured. The photographs said something else. For the first time in significant scale, Americans were being given the opportunity to read both documents at once. What the photographs showed was not staged and was not softened for the audience receiving them. Marines on the sand, Marines in the water. The specific visual reality of what several hundred meters of exposed reef and 76 hours of close fighting had actually produced, delivered to American living rooms in a form that the earlier years of the war had kept at a careful institutional distance. The public response is documented as genuinely significant, a shock that registered in behavior as much as sentiment, reflected in patterns of war bond purchases and public commentary in the period that followed. Americans had been told, in the language of official communiques, that the war in the Pacific was being won. The photographs from Tarawa did not contradict that. They simply supplied the second half of the sentence that the communiques had left out. The photographs were not published to demoralize the country. The documented institutional rationale ran in the opposite direction. Administration officials believed that Americans who understood the actual cost of the war would commit more fully to paying it, not less. They were largely right. They were also, for the first time in this specific and visible way, telling the truth. Both decisions in this story, the earlier suppression of this kind of imagery and the eventual decision to release it, reflected genuine institutional logic about how to manage public understanding of a war still being fought. Suppression protected morale in the short term. Release built a deeper and more durable public commitment once the country had proven capable of absorbing what it saw. This account does not resolve which approach was correct, because both had real justification behind them, argued in good faith by people responsible for holding a nation's support together through a war whose end was not yet visible. What changed after Tarawa was not the war itself. It was the picture of it available to the people paying for it. in dollars, in bonds, and in sons. That is not a small difference. Tarawa was not supposed to teach the Marine Corps how to conduct amphibious assaults. The doctrine for that was supposed to already exist, built from years of pre-war planning and the amphibious operations that had preceded this one elsewhere in the Pacific. After Tarawa, the doctrine existed in a different form, rewritten in specific and traceable ways around the mistakes that had cost more than 1,000 men their lives on that reef in 76 hours. Reef reconnaissance became a standard element of pre-landing planning, rather than a calculated assumption. Specialized amphibious vehicles, capable of crossing coral without depending on tidal height, began moving into the fleet in greater numbers. Naval gunfire support timing and coordination with the landing itself was reworked to close the gap that had let Japanese defenders recover between the bombardment ending and the first Marines reaching the beach. These were not abstract lessons. They were corrections, written into procedure because Betio had demonstrated with total clarity what happened when they were missing. Colonel David Shoup received the Medal of Honor for his conduct during the battle, the specific citation drawing on the documented record of his leadership under conditions that exceeded almost anything the planning for this operation had anticipated. He remained in the Marine Corps for the better part of 2 more decades, eventually serving as commandant from 1960 to 1963, the service's senior uniformed officer. After his retirement, Shoup became one of the more prominent uniformed voices publicly critical of American military escalation in Vietnam, a position that placed a decorated Medal of Honor recipient in direct public disagreement with the institution he had spent his career serving. Whether he explicitly drew a line connecting that opposition back to what he had seen on Betio's reef is not something the documented record allows to be stated with certainty. What can be stated is the sequence. A man who had walked through several hundred meters of exposed water under fire, who had radioed back an accurate report of both victory and catastrophic cost from behind a low seawall, spent the final chapter of his public life arguing for caution about exactly the kind of commitment that had put him behind that seawall in the first place. Most Americans today who can locate Iwo Jima or D-Day on a map have never heard the name Tarawa. This is its own kind of fact, sitting alongside everything else in this account. A battle that reshaped American amphibious doctrine, that produced one of the most significant shifts in how the public was allowed to see its own war, and that has largely receded from popular memory anyway. He had written that they were winning. They were. The photographs confirmed what winning looked like. The communiqué counted objectives. The photographs counted what the objectives cost. For most of the war up to that point, Americans had only been given the first kind of information. After Tarawa, for the first time in this way, they had both.